In this video, we'll look at very briefly the four noble truths of Buddhism. The four noble truths of Buddhism. Obviously, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but it is good to understand what Buddhism talks about because there is something to be learned from it. You doesn't need to be Buddhist to understand Buddhism, right? So Buddhism belongs to, in Buddhism they call it Dharma, Buddha Dharma. Dharma has many meanings, but in this context, the Dharma signifies a group of practices aimed at a certain goal. There are few other meanings to Dharma depending on the context, depending on what subject you are discussing. For instance, when people say it is my Dharma, it means that it is my faith, it is my belief, or it is my matam, or it is my religion. This you see in northern part of India when people say it is my Dharma. And then there is another meaning, Sanskrit meaning from its root word called Dharanat Dharma Muchyate. Dharanat Dharma Muchyate, which means that which binds the society together is Dharma. Again, to attain a certain goal. And then there is another meaning where the Mimamsaka, the philosophers of Hinduism, who expounded on the meaning of the Vedic of the Vedas, they are called Mimamsas. Their definition of Dharma is Chodana Lakshano Dharmaha. So all these meanings are there. Chodana Lakshano Dharmaha. Dharma is that which is mentioned in the Vedas. So as you see, there is so many meanings to Dharma, and Buddha Dharma is one of the. Buddha Dharma means that those practices aimed at a certain goal. So what are the goals of Buddhism? After attaining enlightenment, Buddha started teaching to his community, to his people, to his disciples, and one of the teachings became a predominant part of their Dharma, of Buddhism, which is Four Noble Truths. So number one, there is suffering. Noble truth number one, there is suffering. We'll see the significance of it briefly, of each of these in a little bit, but let me list down all the four noble truths. Number two, there are causes to suffering. Suffering is because of so and so. Number three, cessation of suffering. How to cessate, how to end suffering. That is third noble truth. Number four talks about path to liberation or nirvana, path to liberation or enlightenment. These are the four noble truths that Buddha started preaching, and they got codified in every Buddhist, talks and teaches and learns about these four noble truths. So number one, suffering. What is the big deal about understanding that there is suffering? We all suffer, right? We all know, everybody who is born, right from the birth to the death, there are, from time to time we go through suffering, either mental, emotional, psychological, physical suffering. It is inevitable. So Buddha is saying suffering is inevitable and suffering is there. What it means is, he's saying, see, when we suffer, we say, I suffer, I am suffering. Instead of that, he's saying there is suffering. Understand it, externalize suffering. In other words, when I'm suffering, I'm not simply saying I'm suffering. I'm saying there is suffering inside me, and what is the root of that suffering? Is it, see, when I have a fever, when I have appendicitis, or when I have, when I fall or break a bone or hit my head, or when there is an eye infection, we suffer, right? So there is suffering. So the physical suffering is there, and you take the measures from your physicians, from your healthcare providers to, come out of this suffering. But Buddha is saying mental suffering dominates physical suffering. When there is suffering, you shrink, you go into your cocoon, you go into your little bubble and say, that cycle continues, that repeats. And this suffering is what Buddha is saying about. So instead of saying I'm suffering, you externalize it, you look at your body and say there is suffering in my body. What do I need to do? So when you externalize the problem, the solution starts becoming clear. What do you do? Where do you go when there is suffering? Instead of saying I'm suffering and you get stuck in that cycle. So Buddha is saying there are causes of suffering. Find out what are the causes of suffering. And they go on to describe in great detail what are the causes of suffering. Number 3, cessation of suffering. So as you can see in this continuum, it's not simply 3 discrete entities. It is one single continuum. There is suffering, the causes of suffering, and the cessation of suffering all go together. So see that as one continuum. So all these 3 noble truths. And then the 4th is the path to enlightenment. So Buddha is saying the goal of life is enlightenment, and to attain enlightenment, recognize that there is suffering and find out its causes and stop the suffering. So he lays out a very rather pessimistic view that there is suffering in our life, and goes on to give us more and more hope as we go along in this continuum. Trust in him and work through the process and end up with cessation of the suffering, and then path to enlightenment. So this dharma, see again, this word dharma is a Sanskrit word, but in Pali or in the Buddhistic literature, you will see the word dhamma, not dharma, dhamma. So what happens there is, in Sanskrit, there is irma, dharma, that kind of what pronunciation is called samyuktakshara. When tu ma ra ma becomes rma, so that changes to what is called dvitvakshara, dhamma, ma. So dhamma, so it becomes samyuktakshara. Similarly, bhikshu in Sanskrit becomes bhikkhu in Buddhistic literature. So this type of transformation is seen between Sanskrit and the Buddhistic literature, but Dhamma and Dharma are same. So again, coming back to the 4 noble truths, so there is suffering. Again, in Sanskrit literature, you see the ultimate goal of life is what? Ultimate goal of life is Sukha Prapti, Atyantika Dukkha Nivrutti. Sukha Prapti, Atyantika Dukkha Nivrutti. This is the Sanskrit, or this is the Upanishadic or Vedic saying, yogic, Vedic, all together in Hindu philosophy. The goal of life is to Sukha Prapti, to attain Sukham, and Atyantika Dukkha Nivrutti, cessation of all kinds of suffering and attaining bliss. So that, or happiness, that is the goal. And these 4 noble truths are in line with what is universal. But there is emphasis on suffering, ending suffering, path to liberation. So you can look up more on these 4 noble truths. And as I said, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but it is always good to know what Buddha is saying, and there is something to be learned about it.